Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Lishe Bora, where we dive into practical steps and evidence-based advice to help you make informed choices for a healthier, happier life. My name is Zahra Mohammed. I am a registered dietitian and nutritionist, and today we will be talking about nutrients and cardiometabolic health in type 2 diabetes. So when we look at the word cardiometabolic, there are two words there. There's cardio and there's metabolism. So cardio refers to your cardiovascular system, meaning your heart, along with your blood vessels, your arteries, your veins, capillaries. And then when we talk about metabolism, that is essentially how your body breaks down food or turns food into energy. So there are certain markers or certain things that we look at, when you visit the hospital that enable us to determine or to know the status of your cardiometabolic health. So we look at your blood pressure, your blood sugar or glucose. We also look at your blood lipids or cholesterol, and we also measure your waist circumference. So there's a term known as metabolic syndrome, which we see very commonly in the hospital setting. So metabolic syndrome is when when your blood pressure is elevated, when your blood sugar or glucose is also elevated, when you have excess fat around your waist, so your waist circumference pia iko juu kidogo, and then you also have abnormal cholesterol levels, right? So meaning your LDL, your total cholesterol is, above the normal range. So it's a combination of all of these things: the high blood pressure, the high sugar, the excess body fat around the waist, and then the high cholesterol levels that we call metabolic syndrome. Okay, and so when someone has all of these conditions, this is what essentially contributes or increases the risk of someone having heart disease, type 2 diabetes, stroke, as well as other metabolic diseases such as cancer. It's very normal for, when you eat, it's very normal for your blood glucose levels and your lipid levels to also be elevated, right? It's a normal way of your body responding to the food that you eat. So, of course, after you eat, there will be changes in your glucose levels, in your cholesterol levels. But now the problem comes in when your glucose levels or your lipid levels remain high even long after eating, right? So it is, some people you find will some people find it harder to keep their glucose levels and insulin levels from spiking after eating food. You'll find people who have high blood fat levels for long periods of time after eating. Some people will have problems maintaining both their sugar and their lipid levels. And so it is essentially these unhealthy responses to food over an extended period of time that then contribute to chronic inflammation, to the clogging of the arteries, which we call atherosclerosis. So that's essentially when fatty substances end up clogging your arteries and narrowing them, and then of course problems with your body producing enough insulin, and as we know, insulin is the hormone that is responsible for keeping your glucose levels steady essentially, and then also when you have unsteady glucose and lipid levels, this will also contribute to weight gain. So when we say that someone is metabolically healthy, what we mean is that this individual is able to digest and absorb nutrients from the food that he or she is eating without there being any unhealthy spikes in your blood sugar levels, in your blood fat, in inflammation, and as well as insulin. So in other words, being metabolically healthy essentially means that your body is able to respond to the food that you're eating in a way that is beneficial and reduces your risk of conditions such as obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, kidney disease, and so on. So the focus of this discussion is type 2 diabetes. And when we talk about type 2 diabetes, as most of us know, we are talking about, an unsteady glucose levels or blood sugar levels. And the reason why, elevated blood glucose is a very big problem is because glucose will will affect those very small blood vessels, which we call the capillaries. Remember, the capillaries are the ones that deliver nutrients and oxygen to your cells, to your organs. So glucose usually damages those small blood vessels or capillaries, and so that's where you find people having problems with kidneys. People having kidney damage. What wanapoteza, their vision. Either they lose their vision completely, or vision yao inakuwa not the best, yani inapungua with time. And then also glucose will also damage the nerves, so you find what wanapoteza, maybe the feeling on their hands, on their feet. And so this is typically where the damage will show up first. But then unapata pia glucose will also damage the major blood vessels, so the arteries. And this is where essentially type 2 diabetes and heart disease sort of intersect. So it's very common for people with type 2 diabetes to later on develop heart disease because glucose will also end up damaging the arteries. And wakati, it damages the arteries, that essentially means that mishipa zako za damu, they lose the elasticity, they become hardened, they become narrow, and that of course causes issues with blood pressure, increased risk of getting stroke and heart attack and so on. And our glucose levels ni kitu ambayo we should always be concerned with, not just wale ambao wako na shida na type 2 diabetes, and that is because glucose and unsteady glucose levels will show up in different ways long before someone gets the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. So what do I mean by this? There's a term known as glucose spikes. So a glucose spike is essentially when your glucose levels, rise, above a healthy point, alafu pia inashuka ama it crashes very quickly, And so very common symptoms of glucose spikes is, for example, increased cravings. So you'll find people who constantly craving for food or for something sweet. That is a sign that you have unsteady or unhealthy glucose levels. Also, unhealthy glucose levels can show up in the form of being hungry all the time. So again, there are people who constantly think about food, no matter how much they eat. They're constantly hungry, constantly thinking about food. Again, that is a sign that you need to work on your glucose levels. Unhealthy glucose levels will also show up in the form of fatigue or low energy. It can also show up on your skin in the form of acne, eczema. It can also show up in the form of hormonal problems such as polycystic ovarian syndrome, thyroid, people who have problems with fertility. And then, unhealthy glucose levels will also show up in the form of mood swings, poor mental health, brain fog, or poor sleep. And then, like I said, long term, then someone gets the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and so on. And so essentially what I just mentioned, the increased cravings, the low energy, problems with skin, and so on, those are just different ways in which unhealthy glucose levels show up. And it's actually very, very common these days. And so it is something that once you're able to identify, you can be able to correct and completely prevent or reduce the risk of you developing type 2 diabetes. So it's very important to also talk about how type 2 diabetes develops. And so type 2 diabetes usually comes about because of insulin resistance. And so when I talk about insulin resistance, we mentioned that insulin is the hormone that is responsible for keeping your glucose level steady, right? So when you eat and food is broken down, glucose enters the bloodstream, and so the job of insulin is to enable the cells of your body to take up the glucose that is in your bloodstream. And so with type 2 diabetes, what happens is it usually happens when there's a excess intake of calories, or when you're eating more than your body needs, and so that leads to insulin resistance in your muscles, in your liver, essentially meaning that your cells are unable to take up, or to absorb the glucose that is flowing in your bloodstream, because they're already very saturated with, with glucose or with fat, right? And so the glucose just remains circulating in your bloodstream, yeah. And it's also important to note that when there's high glucose levels, there also tends to be high cholesterol levels. And particularly when I mention cholesterol, I'm talking about the very low density lipoproteins and the low density lipoproteins. If you've ever done a cholesterol profile or test, or they call it a lipid panel, utaona pale kwa results, there's HDL, there's LDL, there's VLDL. So hizi, the low density lipoproteins, hizi ndio they cause they essentially narrow your arteries, yeah. Hizi ndio zina, unapata kuna fatty deposits of fat in your blood vessels. Now wakati your fat is deposited in your blood vessels, then that narrows your arteries, and then that causes problems with with blood pressure. Okay, and also, of course, this also, again, when there's also excess fat circulating, that will also affect, how much insulin your pancreas, is able to produce. So again, pia kuna ile shida ya, your pancreas being unable to produce enough insulin to keep your glucose level steady. So let's talk about a term known as personal fat threshold. So it's important to note that not everyone who is obese or overweight and ends up developing type 2 diabetes, right? And I think some of us might have noticed, you'll find watu ambao they might be overweight or obese, but they're perfectly healthy. They have no problems with blood pressure, with sugar. And then you'll find people who are very lean or very slender and who have, high blood pressure, who have unstable glucose levels. And so when I talk about a personal fat threshold, this essentially speaks to how much fat you can store subcutaneously or underneath your skin and remain metabolically healthy or metabolically active. So let me explain a few things. So when we talk about, how much fat you can store subcutaneously, that is essentially how much fat you can store underneath your skin. So it's important to note that, our bodies tend to store fat underneath your skin, and once it gets to a point where your body can no longer store fat underneath your skin, and it ends up storing fat now viscerally. And I think we've also heard of the term visceral fat. That is essentially when fat is stored around your abdominal area, so around your heart, around your liver, your stomach, your intestines. And so this is the fat that poses the risk or increases your risk of type 2 diabetes, of heart disease, of cancer, and so on. But the fat that you store subcutaneously or underneath your skin is relatively safe. All right, so you'll find that, like I said, some individuals are overweight, are obese, but they are metabolically healthy. The glucose levels are fine, their blood sugar levels are okay. And then you'll find individuals who are lean and have type 2 diabetes. So what this means is that, being fat or being overweight or obese is not necessarily the single explanation of developing these diseases. It's actually fat getting inside your very vital organs, your liver, your pancreas, your heart. When fat is stored, in the abdominal region, then this is where, the risk increases. And so essentially, you're more likely to develop type 2 diabetes if you exceed, your personal fat threshold of being able to store fat subcutaneously or underneath your skin. So you'll find that some individuals are, as they gain weight, are more genetically predisposed to, having fat stored within these very vital organs, like I said, the liver, the pancreas, the heart, whereas some individuals have a greater capacity to store fat underneath their skin and not inside their organs. And so they're essentially able to, even if their weight is very high, most of the fat in their body is underneath their skin, and so that doesn't cause any problems for them. But then for some individuals, so again, genetics is at play. For some individuals, fat will tend to be stored more around the abdominal region, and so it's very easy for them to develop type 2 diabetes. And it's also important for us to talk about, body composition in this case. Remember, our bodies are composed of fat as well as muscle, right? And primarily, of course, there's water, there's minerals, there's so many other things. But for purposes of this discussion, our bodies are composed of fat and muscle. And when we look at fat, for example, we have two types of fat in our body. We have white fat and brown fat. So white fat is the fat that is located not only underneath your skin, but also in your internal organs, in the cavities of your bones. And the purpose of this kind of fat is to store energy, right? It's to provide insulation as well, so essentially to keep you warm, and it's also very important in terms of protecting your organs from damage, right? So it basically cushions vital organs, and it's also responsible for secreting certain hormones that are also very important. So it's not bad. The problem comes in when you have too much white fat. So too much white fat is then what causes obesity. So this is the kind of fat that I'm saying will be in your midsection. So when I talk about the visceral fat, it's essentially that white fat, and it will increase your risk of heart disease, of diabetes, and other diseases. So it does play a role. It is important, but when it is in excess, then that is where the problem is. And then we also have brown fat. So brown fat is, I think most of us have not heard of this one. So brown fat it's called brown because it's actually brown in color, and the reason why it's brown in color is because it's very rich in mitochondria. So mitochondria is, if you can remember the biology that we learned in either primary or secondary, mitochondria is when we're learning about the cells, and the what is constituted inside a cell. We learned that mitochondria is essentially the powerhouse of the cells. It's essentially responsible for generating energy for the cells to carry out, very many different processes. And so this kind of fat is located, for example, in your upper back, around your shoulder, your vertebrae or your spine. And the purpose of this type of fat is, producing heat to keep you warm, right? And you'll notice that, for example, with brown fat, so brown fat is the kind of fat that essentially will create heat to help you maintain steady body temperatures. And then like I said, we also have muscle. So muscle is a very important aspect when it comes to metabolism. And so muscle is not just important from a functional aspect, because remember, it's your muscles that enable you to walk around, to carry out, different daily activities. But muscle is also important from a metabolic aspect, meaning, in terms of helping you particularly break down, not break down, but essentially enabling your body to respond well to sugar and to fat from the food that you eat, right? So it's a very common phenomenon for those who already have type 2 diabetes or high blood pressure. It's very common for them to, for individuals like that to have, less muscle and more body fat, right? Because essentially what we want when we talk about an individual having good body composition, what we mean is that the fat and the fat is more than the muscle, right? So when we look at your body composition, you have more muscle and less fat, right? So when there's an imbalance, so when you have more body fat and less lean mass, then that is where the problem comes in with blood pressure, with sugar, and so on. And so Therefore, muscle is very important. It's important for you to have good muscle stores in order to enable your body to respond well, to the food that you eat, and to prevent any unhealthy responses, such as, high cholesterol levels, high glucose levels, and so on. So that is it for this episode. I hope you have learned a thing or two. In the next episode, we will be talking about certain steps that we can take to certain practical nutrition steps that we can take to improve our cardiometabolic health, both for individuals who have type 2 diabetes and even those who do not. Until our next episode, Assalamu alaikum.